Welcome to the Idea Review. My name is Dami. I'm here with a fantastic guest, Joanne, and we're here to discuss her favorite book. And it's called Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. This was an interesting book. I read a few pages of it, a few weeks ago, and then recently I read kind of most of it in one go. I found it that engrossing and engaging, and what a story. What a story.
Honestly.
Why did you like it? Why did it make an impression on you?
Yeah. So that question of like favorite book is a big one. And it's one that I've struggled with because firstly, I have this thing where when I read books, I genuinely forget like the details of what they're about. But also it's just quite a weighty title to give to something. But I think this book stood out to me because I usually read fiction.
Okay.
So this is a non-fiction book. So I guess it's different to what I would normally read.
Mm.
And I just found it so layered.
Okay.
Like, not only is it historical, because you learn a lot about South Africa and the Apartheid, but it's also a kind of examination of that history from someone who's actually lived through it. It's also funny, which with some of the stories was very hard to do. And it's also like a love story between a mother and son as well. So I feel like for Trevor, and beautifully written. So for him to have incorporated all of that into one book, like I can't not say it's my favorite book.
It was fantastic. It is probably the best example that I've seen of a love story between a mum and son that I ever seen, film, TV, ever, right? Trev's growing up, and I think what he's done is he's interjected lots of history about South Africa, which was really interesting for me. I think most of my reading about South Africa, about that period has come from Steve Biko, who was one of the revolutionary, young student leaders. But what Trevor has done here is he's written this account about apartheid from like more of a wider perspective. So he's written about, him growing up in a few years before apartheid, during apartheid, and afterwards. And I think that history has served well to educate us, and the context of the story is really reflective of his personal story is reflective through the kind of the history of the period. So that's one thing that I found interesting. The strife that comes in general from apartheid is kind of reflected in his life, and we see that through the different stories that he tells. So I want to start off with, let's start off with the main thing, right? It's essentially a book about his mum. It's a love story to his mum. So the admiration that he has for his mum really grabbed me. That's what stood off the page, right? He admires her not necessarily for her accomplishments, but for her character. He's talking about how she would always do her own thing and how she would kind of find a way, despite the circumstances. And I think that was quite beautiful because although she accomplished a lot for, mostly, a single woman at the time, it wasn't her accomplishments that was what stood out to him. What do you think about that?
I hear you. I think the way he described his mum was incredible. Like there were points in the book that she almost felt like not a real person. Like she was this myth, this legend.
Right.
Because there's so many stories, even the minibus story, where, so for context for anyone who hasn't read the book, his mum was very religious and there's nothing that would stop her from going to multiple churches on a Sunday.
Right.
And they got into a situation where, the car broke down, they had to take a minibus, it was dangerous at the time, and I think they were about to get either raped or killed. And his mum threw him, herself, and his baby brother out of the minibus. And just little snippets like that almost made her seem like not a real person to me. And Trevor's really good at describing how apartheid is like the perfect racism, how it was such a rigid system. So for his mum to constantly find loopholes to kind of live in a way that wasn't normal or ordinary at the time, I found that incredible.
Yeah.
And even though I say she kind of seemed like part myth, part woman, you do see snippets of her character and our own parents.
Yeah.
As people
Right.
migrated from one country to another and just have this kind of tenacity and strength and adaptability to their environment. So I really enjoyed the way he talked about his mother.
Do you think that people like her are responsible for the strong black woman trend that people talk about, that people see, as you say, that reflected in some of our parents, and people see that and say, look how strong they are. Look at what they've done.
I guess partly.
Yeah.
Even the way I described her as kind of part myth, part woman, it kind of, that strong black woman narrative almost takes away the humanity of black women in
Okay.
saying that they are superheroes, they are this, they never feel sad, they never feel this. But then it's also a situation of when you're faced with difficulty, you either kind of sink or swim. And we shouldn't really condemn those that are able to excel and swim in the most unfortunate of circumstances.
Right.
So I still kind of have that, admire it versus kind of say she's contributing to that narrative of strong black women, but probably is.
This generational thing gets me a lot. This thing about older generations having to sacrifice so that younger generations can go a step above them and thrive. Trevor's mum had the opportunity to train. She was working as a maid, and then she had the opportunity to train and work as a secretary. So essentially, she kind of raised, her family's opportunities because she was earning more money. And then because of that, Trevor was then in a position to then go to, reasonably good schools and then, become Trevor Noah, internationally known. So, like, did you feel that subtext going on there that, like during apartheid, there was struggle, but the next generation, because it ended, had the opportunity to go on and to create more in the world?
I like the way you kind of described it, because I guess that's the way that me and my friends talk about this generation game.
Right.
That it's almost a relay.
Right.
So your parents pass the baton on to you and expect you to have certain kind of privileges that they didn't have, and so on and so on. And so the next generation will have that baton and have certain privileges.
So it's a common trend that I speak to people about, and people having levels of resentment against their parents. And then to my thinking, it's, for example, immigrants to the UK, to my thinking, it's they face things that we don't face, necessarily in the same way. I'm talking about, poverty, immigrant status, the lack of papers, single parent households. How much can you really do when, you're facing X number of street attacks and people putting poo through your letterbox and so on and so forth. So that's why I really admired it. And I thought that it wasn't really clear. Like, Trevor never said this in the book, but I felt there was, I felt that he thought he had the responsibility to go and do something, and it was empowerment. She empowered him, and I don't think he was really aware of it at the time. She would talk to him about girls. She would talk to him about how to, move around and to be an adult in the life, and she'd beat him a lot. So that, those are some of the funny parts. He would get beatings, and he may not have realized it at the time, but this was her way of empowering him. And that's one of the things that made it a really beautiful story for me.
And that stood out to me because I think she almost did it in a way that it was very explicit.
Yeah.
And she explained what she was doing to him and why.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times it linked to the fact that I don't want you to carry on this kind of generational trauma. I don't want you to turn out like this.
Right.
Like this.
Right.
But I think in our lives, it can often be a kind of unspokenness that happens. And I think Trevor's mum was very, like I said, intentional and explicit about it. And that is good, because what happens when two parties aren't aware of that kind of passing on the baton, I think it almost becomes a kind of miscommunication situation. Like, I'll give you a tangible example. Like, our parents came to this country and they didn't have the luxury to say, what am I passionate about? What do I want to do? It was kind of survival mode.
Right.
So they
That's
took
it.
whatever job was on offer in order to survive and pay the
That's
bills.
it.
It's slightly different for us. We're looking around, we're thinking, what are our interests? What are our strengths? Like, what do I have a passion in? What's my purpose? We're battling all these questions that our parents are just like,
Right.
and a lot of the time, that's where the kind of miscommunication or button of heads comes from, because my parents are like, in my context, this was never a question that I grappled with. It's all about security. It's all about stability. And you're having these kind of existential thoughts that I just can't really relate to. But I thought it was quite beautiful the way that Trevor's mum was very aware, very intentional, and kind of, intentionally passed that baton onto her son.
Okay. And then, so we see some of that in the way, in the schools that he's able to go to. And he's able to go to kind of reasonably good schools and to see different groups of people and to judge how he fits in, in those different circumstances, which was really interesting. My favorite part of this book is how Trevor describes the hood, the ghetto. This is when he's staying in an area called Alexandria. Like this was really amazing to me, right? Because there's so much going on here. And for those who don't know, this is about a time in his life when he's finished school and he doesn't have a job, and he's looking for opportunities. So he essentially, with his friends, just starts hustling, starts selling what he can. He's selling CDs. He's taking the money. He's, loaning money to other people. He's doing things for people. They're just trying to kind of make a living in the area, but they're in the hood, as you call it. And the way he's described being they called it Alex, one of the townships in South Africa, and the way he's described being there and kind of interacting with his friends, the camaraderie of his boys, knowing that all of them are going to eat together. They wake up in the morning, they all eat together, they sell together. But also the relationship of that group with the whole neighborhood, because everybody kind of needed each other. And even when, you're selling someone stolen bread, the person who's eating the stolen bread needs to eat. And it's not as if they have a great number of options and places to buy the bread from, at a reasonable price. So that whole situation of being in the hood and surviving in apartheid was just amazing and brilliant to me.
I thought he broke that down really well. And that's why I say this book is not just to say it's history isn't enough. Like
Right.
It's his cultural analysis of history. Because he broke down the hood in a way I've never heard anyone break it down. He talks about the fact that you never really feel like a failure in the hood because there's always someone wants
that quote was right. Wait, hold on. I want to put the quote in there because that was awesome. Okay, so I actually made a note of the quote because he said, "You never feel like a failure in the hood because someone's always worse than you, and you never feel the need to do more because the most successful people aren't that much higher from you either. It's like being in this environment where everyone's together." And in the case of the township, you're geographically together as well.
Yes.
They're bordered communities. So it's like there's this like interreliability. Everyone relies each other. Everybody knows each other. And yes, there's crime, yes, there's theft and all kinds of things. But on top of everyone kind of being in that kind of social situation, the people also develop their ways of kind of dealing with kind of the issues as well. Yeah.
That really struck me as well.
And
even because there's beauty in what you just described, that sense of community and everyone's looking out for each other. But then there's also another side to it. Like he talks about the fact that you can never get too successful in the hood to the point that your success doesn't better the community,
right?
Because then you become a target,
right?
So it's this constant like there's a positive side, but then there's a negative undercurrent, and I just found that amazing.
I mean, I think what it was that if your success doesn't benefit others, then you become a target. So initially your success is tied to the success of the community, right? And I think it's the same thing, with the hood in America. It's like we're all one, we're all stuck in this place. Your success is my success. We have to do this thing together. And I like the fact that he described the punishments that were given out to people. Right, he said that if you were caught stealing, if you were caught raping, or whatever it was, they would beat you. Like people, like they would beat because, and it's a situation where you can't necessarily rely on the police either, because heavily militarized police and not the kind of service police that you can call it. Was more of a force police that was kind of running in their communities at the time. So. It was a really vivid picture for me being in that situation, being a young person, just trying to find ways to make money, and being entrepreneurial, using talent, because something I didn't know was that Trevor Noah was a DJ and there were DJ parties, and especially, the time that, especially in the late 90s and the early noughties, where there was a lot of new music coming out and hip hop had its thing, and there was lots of Jay-Z Trevor said he sold a lot of Montel Jordan CDs.
Yeah.
You know.
This is how we do. Yeah.
So, and that was another thing I found interesting, actually. The fact that even in South Africa, with the poorest of the poor, you know, people were still listening to the same music as people were listening to in the UK and in America. It was kind of like, and again, it's the same thing. Like the hood in the UK and America is like the same kind of patterns, you know, and then the same kind of patterns in a negative sense as well. The, you know, lack of father figures in communities due to, you know, over militarization of the police, people going to jail, people being killed by in protests, and also like irresponsibility, people drinking their money away, and you know, fighting and stabbing each other and everything. And yeah, all of that is really interesting. Can you tell me about how you feel about what it would be like to live in that time, in that space that he was describing?
Gosh. From the way he wrote it, it just sounded quite cyclical. Like every day was the same. They were making all this money, but they never really got to enjoy it. And then one wrong move by the police meant that their equipment got damaged and their hustle game was gone. So I had kind of admiration for it, but felt kind of sad that I saw so much potential in Trevor, just through the world that he had seen, through the places that he'd been educated, and for him to kind of end up in this cycle with other boys that had come from different backgrounds. It was a bit of a shame to me. But what I really enjoyed, because you were talking about the parallels between South Africa and London and New York, I enjoyed seeing the parallels between like South Africa and other African countries. Yeah. I just enjoy seeing similarities, even if it's just the food we eat. But it struck me when he was talking about names in South Africa. And how people's names were thought to kind of contribute to their character. Yes. And it made me think about like Nigerian tradition and how names are really kind of really important. And are also thought to kind of shape a person's character. And similar in the Ghanaian tradition. So I like seeing those little nuggets of similarity to other places in Africa. Because I will admit, I don't know a lot about South Africa beyond apartheid. So it was quite nice to get those nuggets as well.
In Nigeria, or in the Yoruba tradition, there's something called an oriki, which is essentially a praise poem about one's name that's tied to characteristics, tied to one's lineage, tied to one's family. So, for instance, you know, in Game of Thrones, when, you know, Daenerys is introduced, sometimes they call her the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons, and this and that, you know, this kind of list of attributes. Yeah. So there's a place in the book, and I want to find it, where the same thing happens. Hold on. His explanation for the reason his mum named him Trevor is because she wanted him free to make his own destiny. She didn't want him tied to anything in existence. And even, which is interesting to me, even a biblical name she didn't give him, you know, for someone who's so devoted to church and Christianity. So I thought that was interesting. And they gave him this, you know, name of Trevor, which is now turned into a household name around the world. So the first thing that really stuck out to me in this book, like reading it in chronological order, is the fact that from a very young age as a child, Trevor Noah can see that he associates different things with being black and being white. The white church is nice, it's air conditioned, it finishes on time, whatever. It's in a nice part of town. The black church is harder to get to. There's no air conditioning. It's more difficult. It's more uncomfortable. And there's this theme running through the book of the associations with white and with black. The white areas are nice. You have, you know, lovely upper class areas like Santon in Johannesburg. And then you have, you know, just Soweto, which is, you know, just Soweto, which is just the township, you know. So, like, did you notice that kind of theme running through the book?
Yes. For me, it was more brought to life when, in those moments that Trevor had to choose. As he talks about it being very segregated, like the black people hung out with the black people, the white kids hung out with the white kids, and coloured, as the term he used in the book and the term they use in South Africa, hung out with each other. So it really struck me, those moments in prison and in school, where he had to kind of decide where he fit, because there was so much political juggling in his mind that he had to do in a split second. And he comes to the conclusion that he does feel most aligned to the black group, right? But also talks about the implications of how the other groups treat him as a result of that. So that struck me.
That was really interesting as well. Having so because in South Africa the colored group is a thing, and it's not necessarily a thing in for example in America, right? You have mixed race people who are normally associated as part of the black group, and here, as you said, Trevor kind of volunteers as black when he's given the choice most of the time, but that was only kind of because they had the three different groups. So there's a different racial dynamic that goes on in South Africa than you have in America. And this was my thinking about apartheid, right? Trevor says that in America you had the kidnappings, you had the abductions, you had the slavery, and then you had segregation, right? Jim Crow. In South Africa, you had all three at the same time, all three going on concurrently. So it made me think that actually, when we look at racism as a thing, South Africa should be the premium example. South Africa should be the starting point for how we look at and understand racism, because colored people are given their own race, you know, and colored people are people like Trevor who could be considered mixed race, or people who are historically mixed race because they've come from, you know, Dutch settlers, the Afrikaners, and old South Africans. So when we look at racism, I always emphasize this point that, you know, racism is about privilege and power. It's about the first time the word racism comes in the English language, it's about separating black and white into different educational groups to make it easier to, you know, teach one group one thing and another group another thing. And I thought, like, this is it. South Africa is the premium example of racism in the world. What do you think?
Yeah, it's very true the way he exposes race as completely illogical. And like you said, being based on privilege and power, particularly when he talks about the kind of Indians or the Chinese or Japanese in South Africa, and how they don't fit into any of these kind of made up neat categories that has been set, but based on their position and power and resource and privilege, get told that, okay, you can be in the black group, you can be in the white group. So I really like how he exposes the fact that there's just absolutely no tangible logic to racism.
Right. And this is something that psychologist Dr. Umar said. You know Dr. Umar.
Yeah.
He said this in I think he said this in an interview once. He said that, you know, what the white power structure can do is it can kind of give out kind of membership of whiteness, right? And this is what happened with the Japanese, and the difference between the Japanese and the Chinese in South Africa. What the South African government did is that it gave Chinese people, it didn't know what to do with them. So it said, okay, you know, you just can go with the blacks kind of thing. We don't really know what to do with you. But with the Japanese people, it gave them the status of whiteness, you know, which is amazing, you know. So it allowed Japanese people rights and privileges in society that even Chinese people, black people, colored people did not have. So I think that really speaks to the operation of race as a tool to oppress and so on and so forth, which is what it's about, which is why I emphasize the institutional aspect of racism rather than the casual kind of day-to-day what we might regard as racism. And I think that's what Trevor's done in the book. When he's describing how Soweto is built, he's describing the fact that there are only two roads in. There's one road in and one road out. And that's because it's easier to control people if there's a riot, right? So it's like the operation of the state in physically affecting people's lives, not so much, you know, what somebody might call you like when you went down the street, although that there was that aspect too.
I think that's so powerful and should almost be the way that we talk about things like race. But of course, they are highly emotional, highly moral questions as well. But what Trevor's really good at doing, even the phrase that he constantly uses throughout the book, the architects of apartheid, this is something that has been purposely manufactured in a particular way to get a particular result. And I think there's such power when you really break down the systems and the reasons as to why things are the way they are, because then there's also opportunity to kind of actually understand what is going on. I even give the silly example, well, not silly, but when we talk about town planners, people who reside in, let's take London, for example, how communities are built. We notice that in certain areas that people might call kind of underprivileged or less privileged, lots of fast food and chicken shops.
Absolutely,
lots
yeah.
of gambling shops. So everything is constructed in a particular way for a particular outcome. So I really love the way he breaks that down for us.
That was really good. And yeah, like, the use of space in society. And I think he got that without kind of saying it explicitly. The use of space, who's allowed in certain spaces, if you are seen, if a white person is seen with a black person in public, you would be arrested. It just wasn't allowed. Which spaces are you allowed to occupy and how you're allowed to occupy them goes back to rights. And I think that's a really interesting point. When mentioning the bloodless revolution that took place in South Africa at the start of the book, Trevor explains that it was called bloodless because very little white blood was spilled. There was enough black blood spilled for everyone. And I just remember reading that and thinking about being a young person and just having to see life through the lens of race, and how then it's impossible to get away from race. The first time I heard of Trevor Noah, I think I saw a clip of him on Facebook. Thankfully, I don't have Facebook anymore. That's how long ago it was. But he was, but he did this comedy. He did this comedy set about, and he was talking about race and about the difference between white people and black people and so on. And my thinking was that actually what he's said there is incredibly brave. Comedians have this license to bring up topics that are not always comfortable because they're comedians, right? If you can make someone laugh, you can mostly get away with it. Mostly, as Chris Rock found out. But I think you have to, I was just considering that, being so young and having to see everything through the grounds of race, through the lens of race, and about what that might do to a person.
Yeah, I hear you. I think at times in the book there was this beautiful innocence that Trevor had.
Yeah.
Growing up.
Yeah.
He knew that he was treated differently and things were different for him, but he didn't always know why. So even when we talk about the fact that his grandma and his mum used to make him pray because he was closer to whiteness and they thought that his prayers would kind of reach God first or whatever. Like, he knew that incidents like that in his life happened, but he didn't quite know why. He knew that his cousins got beaten when they did something wrong, but no one ever felt comfortable to beat him. And yeah, I just quite like the innocence at times. He didn't quite connect the dots until we got older, and that a lot of this was to do with his race.
Yes, and if it's not already clear, the book is called Born a Crime because he's born a crime. His parents are white and black, and they're not supposed to be together at all at the time. And that was another thing. His relationship with his father, his white father, who didn't bring him up really, but he always wanted a relationship with him. And I thought that was interesting. And I thought it was interesting that his mother, as a black woman, kind of facilitated that. The system of apartheid took away his opportunity to have a nuclear family, but despite that, his mother encouraged him to have a relationship with his father. And once his career took off, he went to find his father, and his father was even there with cuttings of all of his shows and things to show that he was still watching him and he was still proud of him. And I thought that was cute as well.
I found that moment quite touching
Yeah.
because it was always quite strange to me reading the book that his dad was this kind of figure in the background who sometimes got mentioned, or to Trevor it was just this man's house that they would go to occasionally. But I think that moment really highlighted like him as a father. The fact that Trevor was surprised that everything he had done, his father had kind of kept up to date with and collected. Yeah, I found that really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, do you think though that his father could have done more to stay with him? Because I found it strange that they had no contact. I don't know, it was a number of years that they didn't speak. And, the way he described him, his dad was always prepared to be there for him. But do you think he could have done more to kind of be there physically for him in that period? Because it's strange that he turns up and he says, I've always been watching you, but, they're not communicating by phone. How does that work?
It didn't strike me as strange when I read it, just because of how kind of robotic and formal the arrangement seemed. His mum decided she wanted a child. So nothing in it gave me like love, intimacy, romance. It was so formal. So for me to see a kind of moment of intimacy that was missing throughout the book right at the end got my attention. But I never had those thoughts of his father could have done more, been more present.
Yeah, I mean, because it was clear that his dad was not ashamed of him,
Yeah.
as some white men may have been. Be like, oh, this colored kid over there, but his father wasn't ashamed of him. So it was just interesting that they didn't have a closer relationship, at least for that period. So then he has another father, and this kind of goes back to, like, we talk about apartheid sometimes as like this abstract thing, but as I say, the reflections of the consequences come out in the book, right? So he can't walk down the street and hold his mum's hand because she's a black lady. He looks like a colored kid. If police see them, she'd be in trouble, literally. So that's affected his life. And so later on, his mum meets a man who's no good for her in the long term. And part of the problem is that when he's hit her and she's spoken to the police about it, the police essentially haven't taken any action.
Yeah.
And we see that in patterns of domestic violence all the time, where if you go to the police and you don't kind of receive a solution, you're less likely to speak up about it again, because you think, what's the point? You're putting yourself at risk by raising the issue in the first place. So for me, reading about, the situation with an abusive husband is just like another consequence of apartheid. It's another consequence of the state not running and functioning how it should. When the state doesn't function, there are consequences. People don't have access to the right community services. The police don't get training. Maybe they don't get the training because of funding. Maybe they don't get the funding because of corruption. It's all part of one system, and that resulted in a really kind of negative result for him and his family.
Yeah, it really showed the kind of deadly consequences of this system, but also when other systems kind of clash, because there was also patriarchy as well.
Yeah.
It was deeply present in South Africa at the time, perhaps still is today, that contributed to that. But I found the stepfather angle of the story really interesting. So his stepfather's name is Abel.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, he was abusive to his mother. And what I said at the beginning, talking about his mother as part myth, part human, it was the moments that she was with Abel, for me, that really humanized her.
Okay.
Because any of us could see it wasn't the best situation. But the fact that she kind of stayed or made the best of it or had to do certain things showed me her flaws as a human being and humanized her for me.
Yeah, I think maybe, I think she realized that it wasn't healthy. She realized that the relationship wasn't healthy. And I think maybe she took too much upon herself, in those moments. And sometimes, those are the, And kind of reading it from Trevor Noah's perspective, you can see how sad the things made him.
Yeah.
And it was like, in these situations, it's also not about absolutism, because he never says that, Abel is this terrible person and this and that. He said he had some good qualities, right?
Yeah.
He was a good mechanic. He was funny. People liked him. But with his own family, often, that wasn't the case. So it just kind of spoke to me about, what women had to put up with in particular in those times, because again, they don't have the strength of the state to fall back on. You grow up, you're in a township. Where is the Citizens Advice Bureau? Where are the social workers, and so on and so on. So, that was really sad.
And I guess, again, we see that theme of cycles being brought to life.
Yeah.
So we talked about Trevor's time in the hood and how it just felt very cyclical. I guess one thing that was mentioned in terms of his mother and why she stayed with Abel was the fact that she could meet another man and he'd be exactly the same as Abel and do the exact same thing to her. So there's just constant sense of people being trapped in particular systems or circumstances that they didn't necessarily choose for themselves.
Right, exactly. And she was more, headstrong than the average woman. She refused to kowtow to this man. And in the end, he shoots her. And what I found interesting going throughout this book, okay, so the theme of religion for me is very interesting. I think some of the funniest things in the book are, are kind of Trevor's observations about him kind of going back and forth with his mom about not wanting to go to church, or if I do have to go to church, does it have to be 3 churches a day? And the rest of it, what about Jesus? But why can't Jesus tell us to stay at home if the car's not working? And his mum always saying, no, we need to go to church. Jesus wants us to go to church. And the thing I found really interesting about it is that incident where Trevor's stepdad has actually shot his mother in the head, she survives the incident. And to this day, he admits that he can't explain it. And I think what was really interesting is that he had this cynicism throughout his life about Christianity and about God and about praying. And but it gets to this climactic incident where his mother is shot. He thinks she's already dead, and he speaks to her later and says, how was this possible to happen? And he says, I can't explain it. I have to give you that, And the doctor comes out and says, yeah, this was a miracle. I found that interesting. I wondered about that. What do you think?
I found those moments quite chilling. It gave me goosebumps.
Okay.
Because like you said, previously in the book, religion had been talked about in this kind of comical debate scenario between him and his mum. And at the end, you just see the doctors can't explain how someone gets shot in the head. It misses every major vein or whatever goes on in the brain, every major thing in the brain, and comes out the other side. No one could explain how the particular gun that his stepfather used misfired, because that gun doesn't misfire.
Right.
And just the way that Trevor talks about it really gave me goosebumps. Because I could just feel that kind of no one can explain this. And for myself and my faith, those are the moments that my faith really comes to life. And those moments where, for example, if I'm going through something that no one knows I'm going through, a stranger comes up to me and says something that resonates so strongly with what I'm going through. Those moments are chilling to me, and are the moments where I feel like God and the Holy Spirit really comes to life. So to see it in the book, I was like,
Yeah, I mean, so just for context, her husband shoots her once in the leg, and then stands over her and tries to shoot 4 times, and the bullets don't work, and they actually come out of the gun. The 5th time, he actually is able to shoot her in the head, but she survives, and the bullet goes right through her face. That is probably one of the most amazing kind of scenarios of that kind of gunshot situation ever heard. And sometimes you hear a bullet kind of reflecting off someone's skull. That's happened before, but in this case, the bullet had gone through her head, and I thought it was a beautiful moment, because especially for her and her faith, she had been prayerful her whole life, and of course she wasn't perfect, but she's always, she'd been a good person, as much as we can say, generally speaking, and that was able to kind of work out for her, and she was able to survive. I thought it was such a beautiful,
honestly. How do you get shot in the head and come out of hospital 7 days later? Someone needs to explain
4 days.
Even 4 days.
4 days.
Back at work 7 days
Yeah.
later.
So I think if that moment, I think that will be probably the climax of the film if they decide to do it. And that will be a very interesting thing to see.
There was, for me, another special moment at the end. I think throughout the book, we saw the relationship between Trevor and his mum. And it was this kind of Tom and Jerry cat and mouse situation where she was always kind of chasing him to beat him, and they were just constantly butting heads in different ways. And right at the end, after she gets shot and is in hospital, she makes a joke with him, because they're always debating about who's the best looking in the family. And she makes that one joke saying Trevor, now you're the best looking in the family, because obviously she's got a gunshot wound in her nose. And to see them laugh together at that moment, it just felt very complete to me, because constantly there'd been some sort of friction between them, some sort of Tom and Jerry cat and mouse chase. But to have that moment of intimacy at the end is something that I didn't always see in the book. There was always discipline, there was always instruction, there was always kind of these things that we expect from parents. But to have such a moment of intimacy between them, I felt really kind of...
Yeah, and I think that was probably one of her superhero moments, because, which woman in that situation could bear the pain and, and just kind of make a joke in that. I think that was amazing. And I think there was always a respect there. Even when he was being beaten, there was respect for her. And, you know, as he says, there was a time he was disciplined by Abel, and he felt that this wasn't, the point of this wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It was about Abel exerting power over him. And children can feel the difference. And yeah, I think it was really important. Yeah.
For sure.
Talking about racism, there's an incident in the book where in South Africa, there's a football match being played, and a man comes onto the field, sees a black cat, and kills the cat. I thought it was really interesting because it harkens to a similar situation in the UK that we had recently. A football player called Kurt Zuma, who plays for West Ham, kicked a cat in his house, and the video turns up on the internet somehow, and there's a big uproar, and so his teammate, one of his teammates, Michael Antonio, has to come out and defend him essentially, and says, you know, I don't approve of what he's done, but why is there a bigger reaction to this than there is when someone does a racist incident? I thought that was interesting because in the case in South Africa, the cat incident, you know, made news and everything. It was a really big thing. I just thought that was an interesting parallel as well. A couple of things I didn't like about the book. I didn't like, so it wasn't told in a strictly speaking chronological order. So the stories jumped about a bit, which makes sense for what it was, but it wasn't necessarily always the easiest to follow, especially at the start. One thing I wished he would do, Trevor, is I wish he would explain whether he's had any contact with these characters that pop up from his childhood. So for me, there's this really interesting story about this guy called Teddy that he was friends with, and they go and, you know, steal some chocolate, from a shopping mall
with alcohol in it.
Okay. And they're chased by police, and, you know, Trevor gets away, but Teddy doesn't. So I would have liked to know what happens to Teddy, whether he's ever heard from him again, and so on and so forth. Like, I would like to know like more about the characters that pop up, because they kind of feel like really important people in his life. Okay. What do you think about? And again, there was the girl he goes to prom with, you know, and the girl who had a crush on him at school. You know, it would have been good, don't you think, to kind of hear about them?
It's interesting you say that, because it's only until you mention these characters I'm like, oh yeah, what was the conclusion of that? But I think because the way the book, I know it's nonfiction, but there are times and incidents that he describes that makes it feel like he can't have lived through this. This can't have been a real thing. So at times it kind of veered into fiction for me.
Okay.
So because of that, I guess I saw these people more as characters than actual people,
okay,
and therefore didn't really wonder like what happened to them. But you raise a good point.
Yeah, it definitely felt like you were reading a story. Yeah. You know, one thing I found funny about this this book is that incident we just mentioned with Teddy. He's actually caught on camera doing it. The reason he gets away with it essentially is because he's a colored kid. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, he's mixed race. And on camera, it's not clear on the grainy camera, you know, where, you know, how his skin tone differentiates from a white person. It looks like a white person on camera. And the quote he says is, I want to get this quote right. He says, these people, he said, these people had been so fucked by their own concept of race that they could not see that the white person they were looking for was sitting right in front of them. And I think that just goes to explain a lot about apartheid in South Africa. It's like, this thing is so stupid that you treat people completely differently based on very small variations, you know, in their life. And also the fact that, you know, the rules aren't steadfast. As a colored person, you can apply to become white, literally, you know, and you can be demoted as well. You know, white people can be demoted to go and be with the coloreds, and there's certain areas in segregation. So again, I think Trevor's really described and really got this apartheid thing down to a T. And actually, if somebody wants to learn about apartheid, I mean, I like my Steve Biko. You know, you've got some Nelson Mandela movies as well. You know, his Long Walk to Freedom is a good book, but I think this is just a better contextual, wider lens view and scope of understanding of what apartheid is and what it meant as well than
Definitely.
the others.
I think you could watch a documentary, you could read a factual book, but the benefit of hearing it from Trevor's voice,
Yeah.
both to see the personal impacts that apartheid had on people, but also his kind of, like I said, historical analysis and the way he breaks it down. I think it's kind of a double-edged value that you get.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, yeah, it's an important book for apartheid actually, and I was surprised about that. I was expecting a story about his life, and stories about people's lives aren't always necessarily that interesting. Okay, he went to school, whatever. Are there any final points you have? Are there any kind of issues you want to raise or questions or kind of things about the book that you want to mention?
I'm curious to hear your favorite bits or bit of the book, and then I can share mine.
It's the chapter of Alex. It's the hustling. It's the DJs. Because he kind of finds this skill that he didn't know he had, this entrepreneurship. And I think his mother birthed it in him, but he wasn't really aware he had it until he had a context to use it. And so he's there with his friends, just waking up at 7 a.m., he said, every day hustling, selling CDs, copying CDs, having a computer, being one of the only people, for miles to have a computer and a driver. That's a really, you can really picture that the kind of opportunity being the only person with a computer would afford you. So that whole chapter being in the hood, like that was just gorgeous. That thing about, being in Alexandria in the township was gorgeous for me. What about you? There's another funny bit I want to come back to, but I don't want if you want to mention it.
It might be the one that I mentioned, but so we talked about Trevor being a DJ,
right,
going to lots of different gigs and parties.
Mm-hmm.
They have a particular opportunity at a Jewish school.
Yeah.
And Trevor talks about how it's not uncommon in South Africa to find people with random Western names, such as Hitler, because people just take the names that they've heard and kind of give it to their kids. And of course, he has a DJ crew. They've got a dance crew. They're star dancers called Hitler. Of course, as Trevor's doing his thing, Hitler comes out and starts breakdancing in the middle for these Jewish kids. And everyone's like, go Hitler, go Hitler. I think, I was crying of laughter, and I rarely laugh at books, and that, I could picture the scene.
It was, I think that was but okay, so do you know what? Reading that, I didn't understand why that was funny until I saw the reaction.
Right.
It was the reaction from the lady who was like, and you can just picture somebody losing it in their head, like, what is this? And Trevor explained it earlier in the chapter. It's about, names that have significance. So obviously Hitler was known as somebody who caused all these white people so much trouble. He must be someone that is worthy of admiration. There were people called Stalin and Mussolini as nicknames as well. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. And it also kind of reflects how European culture reflects onto African culture and so on. That was a very funny moment. That was a very funny moment. Maybe they should do a film.
I hope they can capture that moment. I think the bits he wrote about Abel were quite striking. Particularly the incident where Trevor he got bullied by various kids, including other coloured kids. So there's a scene where they attack him with the particular fruit. Like, they just throw lots of fruit at him. He goes crying to his mum and Abel kind of goes back to the kids to protect him. And it starts off being like, everyone wants to be protected. You want that older brother figure, older father figure to go and protect you. But when Abel starts beating this kid, Trevor writes about the transition between feeling that real sense of vindication and someone's protecting me, good, to it turning to something else. And I just thought that was such not beautiful, that's the wrong word, but I just thought that was such a powerful shift from him feeling that this is a good thing to realizing that something was wrong.
Yeah.
And I just felt that anytime he spoke about Abel, it was just so fascinating.
Yeah.
Particularly when Abel was kind of missing in certain parts of the book, but then he talks about it at length at the end. So you kind of join the dots and realize that through some of the other things that Trevor had been telling us about, he would have been suffering with Abel at home, but didn't quite mention it at certain moments. So I just thought that was quite striking.
Yeah, and there's a lot of trauma there. He's seen his mum being beaten. He's seen his brother crying. He's seen his mother being scared for her life, and essentially not being able to do much about it. There's just trauma there, and these are kind of the things that don't get talked about. Oh man,
it's a lot layered.
Yeah, It's an exceptional book. I think it's a really important book to understand South Africa. Actually, I think it's a really important book. You said you had another one?
I think I'm done.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it was a pretty substantial book for me. Yeah, 9 out of 10 maybe.
Oh, that's quite high.
Yeah, no, like I don't think I could have asked for anything more. Maybe they could have played around with the chronology a bit, but I think it was done intentionally to lead up to this climax at the end. So the Abel story makes sense being there and so
Yeah.
on and so forth. Thank you very much, Joanne. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay.